we've been doing this for a number of years, where we try to work with small business and local chambers of commerce to discuss the issues that are really important to California's future, what's going on today in politics and policy. I'm Alan Zarenberg, the president of the California Chamber of Commerce. And I want to thank our sponsors for being part of this. And whenever we ask our summit attendees for speaker suggestions, the number one person who comes up every year is Dan Walters. He's always at the top of the list. Dan Walters is the premier political pundit for California and has been for a number of years. He's been a journalist for over 60 years, following capital politics and policy, and is an expert on many things. But most importantly, he has an opinion on everything, and that's what we're here to learn about today. Dan has worked for a number of Sacramento newspapers, but right now, Dan is doing his work through calmatters.org. So I encourage you to read him on a regular basis. And without further introduction, here's the speaker for today, the California premier political pundit, Dan Walters. Thank you so much for Dan for joining us.
Hi, this is Dan Walters at calmatters.org. And I want to invite you and welcome you to virtual Sacramento, where the legislature is in virtual session and doing maybe virtual things. We really don't know. Whenever the legislature is in session, however, I'm reminded of something that a man by the name of Gideon J. Tucker said back in the 19th century. And that is, when the legislature is in session, no man's life or property is safe. So that's a good aphorism to take when you're considering Sacramento. But on a more serious note, I really wanted to talk today about kind of an overview of what's going on in California, economically, demographically, culturally, and of course, politically at the very end of the parade. You know, sometimes we tend to think of politicians as leaders, as they're leading the band in some way. They're out there front with the baton leading the band. But in fact, in many respects, politics is a trailing occupation. And what goes on in the real world actually creates then political issues for politicians to deal with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the real world of California and how it's been evolving over the last several decades. When you look back at let's say, go back about 4 decades, as Jerry Brown was finishing up his first stint as governor in 1982, and then carry forth to the present time where Jerry Brown just finished up his second stint as governor a couple of years ago. That's a 4-decade period, and the amount of change California has seen during that period is absolutely breathtaking. And we should have been reminded about that just last week when the State Department of Finance told us that for the first time in California's history, California lost population last year. Think about that. This is a state that was kind of founded on the whole idea of go, 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 growth, 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 more people, more people, more people, people coming to California, people having babies. And that was true, very true, until, roughly about 25 years ago or so. Back in the 1980s, think about this. The 1980 census pegged California's population at 24 million. And just 10 years later, in the 1990 census, the population was 30 million, a 6 million person growth in 10 years, a tremendous rate of growth, 2% a year. That's a huge rate of population growth, as any demographer could tell you. But then starting in the 1990s, things started slowing down. Why? What happened? What's going on? Well, for one thing, we had a big baby boom back in the 80s, and the baby boom kind of ended. All those young immigrants who came to California did what young people do, and they had babies. And then in the 90s, the birth rate started to decline, and it declined more in the aughts, and it declined more in the tens. And now we're in the 20s, and it's still going down. Fewer and fewer babies. We were once generating over 500,000 babies a year in California. That's a baby a minute if you do the arithmetic. And it's gone down and down and down and down. At the same time, however, because we're not producing so many babies and because we're not getting so many young immigrants, the population of California is aging. The median age is going up and up. And as the age goes up, the death rate goes up. So fewer babies on one end, more deaths on the other end. That slows population growth. At the same time, immigration from other countries slowed to a trickle. And in state to state migration, we started losing population a couple of decades ago. More people leaving California every year than are coming here. And you put all of those factors together, it adds up to zero or negative population growth. Now, a lot of the news coverage of that event got a little carried away and talked about, well, it was because of the pandemic and all the people who died of the pandemic, or it's this or that or the other. No, actually, if you subtract the people who died in the pandemic, we would have still lost population in California last year. In fact, we probably have been losing population in California for a couple of years, but it just now showed up in the statistics. And this is an important thing because it's one of those life-altering events for or societal-altering event, I should say. It changes everything. It means fewer kids in school in the long run. It means fewer workers coming out of school in the long run. It means more older people who require services in the long run. Over time, it reduces the demand for housing. It reduces the demand, or at least plateaus the demand for consumer goods and services. All of these things are affected by the fact simply that no longer is California a fast-growing state. Even if we move into the positive population growth slightly, take it to the bank. California is not going to be growing like it has in the past. There's no chance it's going to happen. So we're going to hit, we're not even quite 40 million yet. And we may never get, in fact, to 40 million. And think about it, not too long ago, demographers were saying we'd be 50 million by 2030. Well, that's just not going to happen. We'll be lucky if we get back to 40 million by 2030. And it's illustrative of the things that occur, because they did not happen in isolation. Other things have been happening in California over that last same period. One thing that happened is the nature of the economy changed dramatically since the 1980s. We were still somewhat of an industrial economy in those days. It had already started to slow down, but one by one, industrial plants shut down in California. The tire factories, the automobile factories, eventually the aerospace industry got clobbered by that syndrome in the early 90s, which led to a out-migration of more than 1 million people out of Southern California during the 1990s. And that's when we really started to see population decline in California. So we have seen this dramatic change in our demographics. We have seen a dramatic change in the economics. We are no longer really an industrial state. We are now a post-industrial state. We're, from an economic standpoint and from a taxation standpoint, we are very, very dependent on the high-tech economy of the Bay Area, inordinately so. And essentially, it's propping up the entire state in an economic sense, and certainly when it comes to generating revenues for state government and local governments, that's equally true. So we've seen the economy change, we've seen the population grow slow, and we've also have been seeing over this same time period a very, very dramatic change in the makeup of California, the human makeup of California. We were once kind of white bread state. In the 1970s, when I started writing about politics in California, about 85 or 90% of Californians were white Anglo. Today, the white population is well below 40%, actually, or 50%, down actually at around 38 or 40%. In fact, Latinos have become the largest single ethnic group in California. But that's just the most simplistic way of looking at that kind of change. We actually are a state that is made up of dozens of ethnic and racial groups, cultural groups. We are easily the most complicated society on the North American continent. The school system, see this, many school systems have kids speaking 75 or 80 languages. The court system maintains interpreters for something like 150 languages. This is not your grandfather's California. Everything about this state has changed, and changed rather dramatically in a relatively short period of time over the last 40 years. And finally, we are seeing political change on a vast scale as well. At one time, California was one of the most reliably Republican states in the nation. Even up until, you think about this, in the post-war era, the post-World War II era, until 1992, California had only voted for a Democratic presidential candidate twice, just twice, in that post-war period till well into the 90s when Bill Clinton won in 1992. And ever since, Democrats have won every single presidential election in California. But just a decade earlier, in the 1980s, look at the makeup of the political makeup of California. In the period between 1980 and 1990, there were 10 top of the ticket elections in California. Top of the ticket meaning governor, senator, or president. There were 10 top of the ticket elections in California, and Republicans won 8 of the 10. And this carried into the 90s, into at least the mid 90s. In 1994, not only did Pete Wilson win re-election to a second term, rather handily over Jerry Brown's sister, Kathleen Brown, but Republicans took half of the statewide offices that year and even had a nominal majority of the assembly. Think about that. There were 41 Republican seats in the state assembly in the mid 1990s, and now it's down to what, 20, maybe 22, 23, something like that. That's an enormous change over that period. What happened? Why did California undergo such a dramatic political change during that period? Well, demography is part of it. The outflow of population after the collapse of the aerospace industry changed the politics of Southern California generally, but particularly the politics of Los Angeles County. And up until that point, Los Angeles County, as big as it is, about a quarter of the state's population, Los Angeles County was essentially neutral. A Democrat or a Republican might win by a few votes one way or the other, but Republicans held many of the county's congressional seats and legislative seats. And LA was essentially neutral, which meant that the interior of California, plus San Diego and Orange counties, which if you look on a map, is like a fish hook, and people called it the fish hook, down the center of California and hooking into San Diego and Orange counties, were very reliably Republican in those days, offsetting the very reliable Democratic tilt of the San Francisco Bay Area. And in that mix, actually, Republicans could do very well. They could win statewide offices easily and frequently. Think about it. It was basically a Republican state, a purple state maybe, but a Republican state. Ronald Reagan, of course, was elected president, won California's presidential elections twice in 1980 and 1984. And George Bush won the presidential vote of California in 1988. But after that, that was all done. So what happened? Well, when the aerospace industry of in Southern California kind of collapsed with the end of the Cold War, and contracts were canceled, military bases were shut down, the county saw a huge outflow of population. In Southern California, an estimated 1.25 million people left Southern California for other places, and most of those from Los Angeles County. But in the meantime, the county had seen an inflow of immigrants from Latin America and from Asia, and a resurgent labor union movement among immigrant groups in the service industries that replaced the aerospace industry. As a result, LA's politics started moving leftward to the point where it basically is as blue as any place in California, as blue as the Bay Area. Republicans hold very few local seats in the legislature and Congress, and basically Southern LA, and then now shifting into Orange and San Diego counties have become much less Republican than they once were. And you put all that together, you see a Republican Party that's declined to under 25% of the registered voters, and a handful of legislative seats, a handful of congressional seats, a tremendous fall from political power that they enjoyed just within the last 30 years. It's been a tremendous change. Now, all of these changes including the political change, affect the output, what goes on in the political realm of California. Very dramatically affects it. What this was the seat at one time, as we can all recall, the seat of the much vaunted tax rebellion in 1978, the passage of Proposition 13, which heralded that period there of the 1980s and into the 1990s of Republican strength in politics in California. And so at one time, we had this very more or less dependably conservative political atmosphere in California. But what happened, obviously, is that as the Republican registration fell, as newcomers to California, Latinos, Asians, became active in voting, became more democratic. And frankly, what happened is Republicans alienated a lot of white voters, the white suburbs of California that had once voted Republican, even in the Bay Area. Back in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, you saw Republicans from the whole legislative and congressional seats from San Francisco Peninsula, from the East Bay Area, Contra Costa County, all elected Republicans. They went away. Republicans lost traction in the more affluent white suburbs that had been a bedrock area for the Republicans, including Orange County was certainly an example of that, and most of San Diego County was an example of that. But as that occurred, not only did the Democrats achieve more power within the Capitol overall, but finally, super majorities, and then most recently, super duper majorities. Basically, 3/4 of the legislature now is Democratic. And it has moved the political atmosphere in the Capitol several notches to the left. How far to the left, we don't know, because there's been some constraint upon that in recent history. Jerry Brown particularly, Jerry Brown 2.0 was kind of a dampening or conservative or moderating influence in the Capitol as long as he was as governor, following Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was kind of the same way, and even following Gray Davis, who, except for his affinity with the public employee unions, was something of a moderate himself. Now we have not only a super duper Democratic majorities in both houses of the legislature, but they are dominated overall by the more left wing of the Democratic Party, or progressive wing of the Democratic Party. The wing that, for example, denied Dianne Feinstein the party's endorsement when she ran for re-election in 2016, and gave it instead to one legislator, and the legislator who was challenger. That illustrates that the Democratic Party has not only become larger and more powerful within the political realm, but it has moved markedly to the left. And you see that in what's been going on in the legislature over the last couple of years. Once Jerry Brown left, the progressive wing of the party saw an opening, saw an opportunity to do things that they have been wanting to do for a long time, but had been constrained from doing so mostly by governors who were relatively moderate. But they saw in Gavin Newsom a simpatico figure, somebody who sympathized, who verbally at least endorsed the agendas that the progressive wing of the party wanted to implement, such things as universal preschool education, single payer health care. That's the kind of agenda that the left wing of the party. Now, what are they up to? What do they really want now that they're in the ascendancy in the Capitol? I think, and they really don't make many bones about this, what they really want is to make California something like the Western Europe welfare states, Sweden and Germany and France and Norway, something like that, with much more lavish public benefits, of all kinds, paid for, of course, with much higher taxes. And Gavin Newsom has essentially, verbally at least, endorsed virtually all of that agenda and added a few things to himself. But he was constrained somewhat as well in his first year as governor by just being the first year as governor, and had some financial constraints. Obviously, the pandemic constrained him further last year. I mean, he put off a lot of stuff simply because, well, it's pandemic. You got to deal with that. Whether he deals with it effectively or not is something the voters may pass judgment on later in the year. But now, in this year, in 2021, the pandemic appears to be in remission, hopefully, thankfully. And by the quirk of, I guess you'd call it pandemic economics, the efforts by the federal government to keep the economy booming with low interest rates has then generated huge gains in the stock market, which have then translated into a cornucopia of revenues for the state government. How much? The governor said the other day that we have a 75 billion, that's billion with a B, budget surplus. Now, he hasn't told us the details of that, how they came to that conclusion, but he assumes it's true and is basically proposing to spend all of that $75 billion, plus another $25 or $26 billion in federal relief funds for what he calls a $100 billion package of services and reforms that would advance to some degree the agenda of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Start off on Mother's Day with a announcement that they're going to expand childcare, another one of the tenets of the left agenda. He backed that up later this week with a whole new array of just simply giving money to people on the theory that it will stimulate the economy. He wants to hand out about $20 billion in direct payments, $600 per taxpayer up to a certain income limit, and also money to pay all the past due rent bills for the people who fell behind on their rent, and to pay all the past due utility bills. He's added more to the pile, including a $15 billion program to combat, he said, and eliminate homelessness. And we still have more to go because he'll finally unveil the whole package on Friday. And it's like a Democratic, it's like if we call it the Bernie Sanders advocates, the Sandinistas, it's like the Bernie-crats. It's the Bernie-crat dream agenda, basically. It lacks only universal health care, and we haven't heard about that yet, but we'll probably hear something about that in the budget as well, expanding health care coverage, Medi-Cal coverage, possibly more to undocumented immigrants, for example. So this is, I think you might say, is Gavin Newsom's big chance. He always likes to do the big thing, what he call the big, hairy, audacious goals. And this is his chance finally, with money in the till, or at least he says the money's there, to do some of these big things. And he also has obviously financial and political support coming from the Biden White House. So we don't know how much of it's going to go through the legislature, probably most of it, because the legislature is dominated by people who endorse that agenda and the leadership seems to be behind it. It'll be an experiment, but there's also a danger to it. The danger is this. A lot of this money that he wants to spend is essentially one-time money. It's money that comes from this windfall of taxes on capital gains and incomes among the affluent. Remember, the top 1% of income taxpayers in California, about 150,000 tax filers, pay almost half of all the income taxes. And those folks have done very well in the stock markets and other investments over the last year. And California is reaping the bounty of that. But it's one-time money, or at least it's not money that you can say will be there year after year after year. And the danger of it, it strikes me, is that he is raising expectations. He's raising expectations that we will have universal childcare, free or no little low-cost childcare, that we will achieve his goal of universal healthcare coverage, if not single-payer healthcare coverage. That's a more complicated issue. And other items on the progressive agenda. He's raised things that this is the way it is. It's going to be, he describes it as a change, a massive change. It's something that's going to be a whole new world of California. Maybe he's overselling it, I don't know. But that's the way he describes it. But he's raising those expectations that we're going to start approaching the Western European model of social democracy. But where's the money going to come from to sustain it? And the danger, it seems to me, is, or the peril, or the uncertain factor in all this, is that once you start offering entitlements of any kind, and you might say, well, we can shut them off if we don't have the money. That's an extremely difficult thing to do, virtually impossible. So what happens if you build up the expectation and people start getting these benefits, they start expecting these benefits are going to be there. And then when you don't have the money to pay for the benefits, then the drumbeat of taxes, higher taxes, is felt. And as we probably all know, California is not a low taxing state. California has really quite a high tax level. We're in the top 3 or 4 or 5 states when it comes to the combined state and local taxes, about 12% of personal income. And that's about as high as it gets in the United States. We're up there with New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, and we're in the top tier states already. So the question then is, can it go higher? Well, there's an appetite in the legislature certainly to make it go higher. I think the California Taxpayers Association said that something like $200 billion a year in higher taxes are contained in the bills that have already been introduced this year. Now, I don't think they're going to pass anything this year. In fact, the governor has said, no, we're not going to do more high taxes this year. After all, he does face a recall election and doesn't want to do anything that might upset the apple cart. But the question is not what's going to happen in 2021 or maybe even in 2022. The question is what happens when the inevitable next downturn comes in the economy, when tax revenue plateaus out or even declines, and we have all these new entitlements that people have become accustomed to. It's the kind of the catch-22 of what he's proposing, and it'll be the other shoe that drops at some point down the line. Now, he may not even be governor by that time. He may be a United States senator by that time. That's entirely possible. But at some point, when you offer all these enhanced entitlements to people and people get accustomed to them as being their right, then you have a problem when the bill comes due. And this is what we don't really know what's going to happen in the long run and this thing. So we're in this period of change. We have had the demographic change. We've had the economic change. We've had the partisan change. Now we're going to see the fruits of all that, or the outfall of all that in what the governor proposed to do, something that is transitional, it changes everything. And it'll be a vast experiment in one state, whether California can go down the Western European model, high taxes, high services, and frankly, as a model perhaps for the rest of the country, if the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has its way at the national level. So once again, we're in the spotlight. We were in the spotlight 43 years ago when California launched the tax rebellion with Proposition 13, and later the GAN spending limit, which by the way may be triggered by this cornucopia of legislation this year. The money that the governor wants to give back to people, tax money, basically satisfies the GAN limit, or may satisfy the GAN limits mandate that when revenues grow to a certain point, you have to give some of it back. And he says he's giving some of it back. So this is the state that launched the tax revolt with Howard Jarvis and Paul Gahn, and eventually with Jerry Brown, who signed the bill to put the GAN limit on the ballot in 1979. And here we are 43 years later, once again in the national spotlight, not as the seat of a tax rebellion, but perhaps as a model for transforming into a Western European style social democracy. So once again, here we are back on the cutting edge. Whether it's a good cutting edge or we'll all get sliced up by it, it's hard to say. And with that, on that happy note, I should say, I'm going to turn the program back to Alan Zarenberg, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today.
Well, our sincere thanks to Dan Walters, who laid the foundation for what we're going to do next, which is a little different than what we've always done at our Capitol Summit. And we're going to talk a little bit about policy and politics. We have the Chamber's Executive Vice President, Jennifer Barrera, here, who runs our policy program and oversees all our lobbyists and how we establish our policy. And also we have Marty Wilson, who is our Executive Vice President for Public Affairs, who oversees our political operation here at the Chamber. And I think we're going to start a little bit with picking up Dan's comments and a little bit of discussion about how this all plays out in the legislature today, with the governor today, and I'm sure what's for many national journalists, well, maybe journalists is the wrong word, political pundits, the recall is the entertainment of the year for them, since they don't have an entertaining president like they used to. So they're looking for things to talk about, and we're going to talk about that. So Jennifer, can you talk a little bit about how do you see this playing out in the legislature? You know, we have, Dan talked about the demographics. You know, the governor's got plenty of money to spend, but you can't buy rainwater. So we're in the middle of a drought, and are those important issues? We have energy reliability issues that last year we almost shut power off during the hottest days. So are a number of issues that are in front of Californians that affect California business. How do we see the legislature? What are they doing and what are they addressing?
Yes, thank you so much, Alan, for the introduction. It's so great to connect with all of you here today and be able to talk with you about what's going on at the California legislature. There's a ton of activity, of course, and so I'm happy to be able to present those issues to you here today. As Alan indicated, there are a number of issues facing California with regards to the drought, the energy issues that we have, housing, homelessness, just a number of activities going on. And the legislature is certainly doing what they do best, which is introducing bills and moving them through the process. There's over 2,400 bills that have been introduced this year on, again, a number of issues. Cal Chamber is engaged on over 100 of those bills, either support or opposition. And so we certainly have our work created or cut out for us this year. We're at the point in the legislative process where the members are having to face the House of Origin deadline, where they have to get their bills out of their respective houses in order for those bills to continue moving through the process. That deadline is June 4th, so we are all preparing to deal with the floor votes in both houses on a number of bills. And there's three that I actually wanted to highlight for you here today, if I can, to really get your support in our efforts at the state level to stop these bills before they move on to the second house. And so if we can, it'd be great to, I have a brief PowerPoint presentation with these bills identified so you can write them down and become familiar with them, and hopefully, as I mentioned before, support our efforts here at the state level by reaching out to your local legislators. So we'll go ahead and get started with that if we can, Shandy. Thank you. The first one that I wanted to highlight is AB 995 by Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez. It's dealing with paid sick leave. And as many of you are already familiar with, California has a paid sick leave requirement here that was introduced and authored by Assemblymember Gonzalez several years ago. AB 995 seeks to increase that mandate. So right now, California employers of all sizes, even an employer with only one employee, is required to provide at a minimum 3 days of paid sick leave or 24 hours of paid sick leave, whichever is greater. And that also comes with some challenges with implementation, such as how an employer accrues the paid sick leave, how they document that on a wage statement, notice requirements, and of course, enforced through a private right of action. So the paid sick leave requirement of 3 days is being proposed to increase to 5 days or a minimum of 40 hours in AB 995. This is challenging for a number of reasons. One, a new mandate on employers who are already struggling as a result of the pandemic, who have been financially devastated by the pandemic and are just having the opportunity to reopen and rebound from the devastation they have faced for this last year, should not be subjected to a new mandate and a paid mandate on top of it. Now is just not the time. But in addition to that, California already has implemented COVID-19 supplemental paid sick leave. That was just passed earlier this year as a part of the budget process and requires employers to provide 80 hours of paid sick leave for employees for any reason related to COVID, whether an individual has COVID, taking care of an individual with COVID, has potentially been exposed, getting the vaccination or having side effects of vaccination. So employers are already dealing with that paid mandate. And then in addition to that, California employers this year with employees of only 5 or more are already dealing with the California Family Rights expansion that went into effect in January and requires employers to provide 12 weeks of time off for employees for medical reasons, taking care of family members, or taking care of themselves. So again, employers are already challenged with a lot of mandates that just went into effect this year. They're struggling coming back from the pandemic and trying to rebound from that. And again, we just don't need a new mandate like an expansion of paid sick leave at this time. So we are encouraging all of you to reach out to your legislators, echo those concerns, ask them to vote no. I can't express to you how important it is for the legislators to hear from their businesses in their district, the employers in their district. It makes a huge difference. We appreciate your support on that. The next bill that I wanted to bring to your attention is AB 1119 by Assemblymember Wicks. This is dealing with the Fair Employment and Housing Act, which is California's anti-discrimination law. And it seeks to expand that in 2 ways. One, it wants to create a new protected status under the Fair Employment and Housing Act for anyone who has family responsibilities, meaning they're caring for a minor or they're caring for a dependent in some way, either an elderly dependent or again, a minor who needs medical assistance. And it would create a protected classification, meaning that if any employee is disciplined and falls within this protected classification, that individual can say that they were disciplined or terminated perhaps on the basis of their protected status as someone with a family responsibility as opposed to violating the company policy. For example, maybe an employee has a number of unexcused absences at work, and the employer has a policy that disciplines an employee for unexcused absences. If the employee says, well, those unexcused absences were due to my family responsibilities, there becomes a question as to whether or not the employer can actually take that adverse employment action without being subject to potential litigation for discriminating against the individual due to their family responsibilities. It creates a huge challenge for employers who are trying to manage their workplaces and subjects them to litigation unnecessarily. The bill also proposes to amend the Fair Employment and Housing Act to require an employer to accommodate an employee who has family responsibilities with regards to a school that's closed unexpectedly or a care center that's closed unexpectedly. Obviously, as a result of the pandemic, we saw a lot of employers and employees struggling with school shutdowns, care facility shutdowns. But this bill goes beyond that, and really anytime there's a school closure or care center closure, it would require an employer to accommodate an employee, which would include providing unlimited time off, providing an extended leave of absence at times for the employee, and again, creating a huge challenge for employers to manage their workplace. So again, we're asking you to reach out to your legislators on this one. Tell them to vote no on this new burden on small employers. Again, FEHA is applicable to anyone with 5 or more employees, and really support our efforts to try and stop this bill before it moves on through the process. The last bill that I wanted to highlight for you is AB 71 by Assemblymember Luce Rivas. And this one is a tax increase on companies that operate internationally and do business here in California. As you just heard from Dan Walters, the state has more than enough money right now. We're looking at a $75 billion surplus. And so now is definitely not the time to be increasing taxes anymore here in California. But nonetheless, this bill has been moving through the process, and we are concerned with trying to stop it on the assembly floor before it moves any further. The bill, as I mentioned, would be applicable to companies that operate internationally and do business here in California. It would increase the amount of income that they're required to appropriate here to California. So, of course, more tax revenue on that income appropriated or allocated here to California. The estimates are that the tax increase would raise $350 million the first year, and then over $900 million each subsequent year, which is a sizable amount of money, obviously. And they propose to dedicate that to dealing with the homelessness crisis that we have here in California. Of course, homelessness is something that is important to everyone here in California, but raising taxes at a time when we have a budget surplus is just not necessary, and we need to say no to any further tax increases. With that, I want to lead into some of the discussion that Dan also brought up with regards to the governor's budget and how he has been introducing different projects that he's going to be spending some of this budget surplus on. One of them being the homelessness. Just yesterday, he announced that with the $75 billion surplus that the state has, he will be dedicating $12 billion to dealing with homeless by providing rental assistance, by providing additional housing, providing over 15,000 workers to go out and clean up public areas for encampments and along the freeways. So again, he's already dedicating resource towards this issue. We don't need another tax increase like AB 71 to really fund any more efforts on homelessness at this time. In addition to the other proposals that have been coming out in the budget, I just again wanted to highlight some of the things that Dan mentioned. One, he is proposing to put a tremendous amount of money towards water and infrastructure to deal with the drought. Of course, money won't make it rain here in California, but he is trying to provide some additional resources towards infrastructure, clean water, groundwater management to address some of the issues that we're facing because of the drought. He has also announced the Golden State Stimulus, directing payments back to taxpayers at a certain income level who have dependents, and providing them checks covering unpaid rent and unpaid water and utility bills. And then today, although I haven't seen the details, announcing more investment in public education. So we'll be looking for his full May revised budget that should be coming out soon, but these daily announcements give you an indication of where some of that surplus will be being spent. With that, I'll turn it over to Marty.
Yeah, Marty, I think is a great segue into talking a little bit about the governor's priorities and what has proven to be, I think, for the national political pundits, the recall of Governor Newsom. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the timeline and how it works and what to expect from what's going to happen.
Sure, happy to do that. I think that every time Alan suggests that somehow this recall is entertainment for the national press, I'm always reminded of the saying that politics is entertainment for ugly people. So I'll try to run through some of where we are in that process. The kind of the dominant two issues in the Capitol right now on the political front are the recall, of course, which Alan mentioned, and I'll talk about, but I also want to spend a few minutes talking about redistricting.
Absolutely.
And where we are in that process. Shandy, I think we got a slide on where we are, the timeline here, if we could get that up. So you see these lines through the slide here in terms of the recall process. We spent a fair amount of time at Cal Chamber last fall when I realized when it began to look like this was a real thing, that it was going to perhaps happen. Really understanding the how long of a process this is. And because the proponents of the recall were saying, oh yeah, we're going to get this certified and we'll have an election in July or August. And that's simply not true. And even they have conceded that. So where we are now is that we've received the notice from the Secretary of State that there are sufficient signatures for the recall to go forward. I think the proponents ended up turning in over 2 million signatures, and they had about an 80% validity rate. So that's good. I mean, that's a very strong performance by the proponents, and about 1.7 million signatures were verified. Where we are now, though, is that there's a process that's fairly new to California, but it was put in place by the legislature a couple of years ago when there was a recall for a legislator in Southern California, where voters are given the opportunity to remove their signature. Maybe they felt they were sold a bill of goods. This was not something that they bought into, or maybe they were angry at the time, but now they've changed their mind. There was some effort at one point to talk about reaching out to voters to get them to pull their signatures. The people that sign those recall petitions, their signature is private. It's not public information. And so I think the opponent, one element of the recall opposition, led not really by the governor's folks, but somebody else, former legislator by the name of Don Parada, I think realized that they've run into kind of a brick wall. So we don't really think this is going anywhere. They have until, our timeline says June 21. I think that's been accelerated a little bit, probably sometime middle part of June, when we get the final numbers from the Secretary of State's certifying that the county process is fairly complete. And then can I get that slide up there just one more time? And then what we have then is a bunch of a process that involves the Department of Finance to analyze the recall cost, and then the Legislative Budget Committee has to review it as well. And so they probably complete this process sometime towards the end of August is my estimate. And then it actually goes to the Lieutenant Governor, who says, okay, this recall is ready to go, and sets the election date. I think we speculated at one point that the election would be in mid-November. I think it's going to be a little earlier now, if I had to guess, but still it will be just about to the day, a year before the 2022 gubernatorial election would happen anyway. So once they set that date, candidates have 59 days to file their candidacy. Right now, there's some 50 or 60 candidates that have indicated they want to run. How many end up running, I don't know. I was involved in 2003 working for Arnold Schwarzenegger during that recall of Gray Davis, and we had 135 candidates running for governor that year, and Arnold, I think, got something like 48% of the vote. But that was an extraordinary circumstance, an extraordinary time, and I think just the atmospherics where we are today in California are much different than where we were in 2003 for a variety of reasons, many of which I think Dan touched on just in terms of the demographic changes in the state. So there's been a lot of polling on the recall. People always ask, what do the polls say? We've seen some private polling, some public polling. Interestingly, they all say about the same thing, that there's support for the recall is somewhere just south of 40%. Opposition to the recall is hovering right around 50, 52%, somewhere in that range. So right now, the folks that want to recall Gavin Newsom, they have a steep hill to climb for a variety of reasons. One of which, of course, is just the state of play with voter registration in California. So the most enthusiastic group for recalling Gavin Newsom are Republicans. No big secret there. They support the recall. About 80% of GOP voters said that they support it. A smaller percentage, but still a significant one, of Democrats say they're opposed to it. That Newsom, in their view, is doing just a fine job. His approval rating is fairly strong. Right around 50%. It's declined a little bit, but he's still in relatively good shape. Where the variable lies and why some polls are bouncing all over the place is among independent voters, and some polls have the independent voters favoring the recall, some have opposing. It's hard to say right now without looking at the internals of all of these polls. But my guess is that again the strength that the Democratic Party has in this state with about 48%, I think, of the registered voters. It's over 40%, I guess, registered voters. Republicans are around 25%, and decline to stay voters are around 24%. So, as I like to say, Governor Newsom is hunting a pond where there's a lot more ducks than the other group has. Just the last piece on it, of course, to run a successful recall campaign, it does take money. People don't realize that when Arnold Schwarzenegger ran in 2003, he was outspent. Governor Davis at the time had significantly more money than Arnold Schwarzenegger, but Arnold Schwarzenegger had near universal name ID and was a celebrity and created a lot of interest in his campaign. Arnold also funded his campaign, or self-funded a good chunk of it, and people forget about that. Just in terms of where we are right now with money, the leading candidates are John Cox and Kevin Faulconer on the Republican side. Cox has raised about $7 million. At least 5 or 6 of that is his own. Faulconer has raised a little bit over $2 million. The opposition to the recall, the Stop the Republican Recall Committee, has raised $3.5 million, has about $2.5 million on hand. But the other thing that's important to remember about the recall is the recall is actually like a ballot measure campaign, and so the opposition to the recall can accept donations in unlimited amounts. And my guess is they'll have as much as they need to beat it back. The candidates running for the recall are subject to contribution limits. Governor Newsom is sitting on about about $24 million sitting in the bank for his reelection committee, but he won't have to spend that. I think if we got enough time, I'll just talk about.
Well, before we get into reapportionment, which is important for everybody to understand and to play a role in, let's just talk a minute about how this is all going to work in practical terms. So, right now it's quite clear that the Democrat Party is trying to encourage all Democrats not to run, so that the message is this is, a Republican takeover and a special election. So the way it works, you can chime in a minute here, Marty, but everybody gets to vote yes or no on the recall, but regardless of that, after the ballot measure, everybody gets to vote for a candidate, including so let's say most of the Democrats vote no, but it still passes, they still get to pick a candidate. If at the last minute there's a credible candidate, like a Bernie Sanders, on the Democrat side throws their hat in the ring, isn't that where the Democrats are going to likely go if it passes and vote? And so, it doesn't guarantee a Republican's going to win the election, right?
Right. Yeah, that was always kind of one of the things that I cautioned the Republicans about. As I said, look, there's 3 things that can happen if it qualifies for the ballot, and 2 of them are bad. And certainly one of the bad things from a Republican perspective would be if a credible Democrat got into the race. They, with that many Republicans, you've got, 3, 4, maybe 5 Republicans splitting up the vote that are at least what I'll call credible. Then that lone Democrat, again, there'll be Democrats running, but that lone, what we'll call the credible Democrat, stands a very good chance of being the next governor. And we saw that in some early polling. A group called Wilson Public Affairs, no relation, a lot of us running around, actually showed, I think, that Antonio Villaraigosa, former mayor of LA, would be the strongest candidate, again, in this hypothetical matchup. It's interesting because it's a 1-2 question. I didn't really, you're correct to point that out, Alan. So you're going to get a ballot, yes or no, on the recall, and then which candidate do you choose? If no wins, doesn't matter who you chose, but if somehow yes wins, then the top vote getter becomes governor, and it could be somebody with 30% of the vote could be elected governor.
So a couple things, and then I think let's talk about reapportionment, and we'll come back to Jennifer a little bit. Gray Davis not only had an energy crisis, and he also had a budget deficit. I don't think we've ever seen a governor have more than, anything close to $100 billion surplus to spend. And so maybe some of the issues that you've seen in the polling, as Jennifer pointed out, homelessness, affordable housing, energy or, water, certainly the drought, the governor has the ability to spend money on. Gray Davis never had that. And so things are really quite different in front of the electorate today than they were in 2003. And, the state's going to benefit from all this money.
Correct.
And the governor has designated June 15th right now as the date to open up California. So,
Yeah.
which is be interesting. And I think from your perspective, as the more we improve our economy in the pandemic and people are allowed to open up and move around, whether tourism comes back by the election in October or November may have a role to play, but other things are coming back, and the economy's obviously doing well, or we wouldn't have these kind of revenues.
Yeah, no, he's in a very strong position.
So we'll come back to the legislature in a minute in policy, but why don't you talk a little bit about reapportionment, because we need everybody's involvement in that.
Yeah. So California, because of Propositions 11 and Proposition 20, which were supported by Cal Chamber, California has a redistricting commission, a bipartisan independent commission that's been recruited and is now in place and waiting to do their job. There's delays naturally, like because of the pandemic, and getting the census data so that they can actually begin the process of drawing the maps. In a normal circumstance, right now we would probably be in a pretty frenzied pace of looking at maps, getting comments on them, and seeing which direction the commission is going. Unfortunately, again, because of the pandemic, the census data has been delayed, and so the commission won't actually get that information until sometime in the fall. I think that it's also important to note, and you've probably seen the stories, and certainly Dan referenced it, is California lost a congressional seat for the first time, I believe, ever. So we go from 53 to 52 seats in our congressional delegation. Obviously, the legislature and the Board of Equalization numbers are set by our own Constitution. So there's going to be a lot of hand wringing among incumbent office holders in terms of which districts get carved up. I think the conventional wisdom is that where the impact will be the greatest in terms of loss of representation or power, or however you want to describe it, is going to be in what I would call the LA Basin, Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Gabriel Valley, where there's been the least growth. The last just little point I'll make, and we go back to our discussion, is that among the things that the district or the commission has to consider are communities of interest, and certainly ethnic and geographic boundaries are important, but they also they view that communities of interest are economic interest as well. And that's important for our local chambers to keep in mind, that where people work and for what types of business they work is going to be critically important to the commission in terms of how they draw the lines. And so there's a lot of you out there watching us today on TV. I wish you could all be with us in person, but there will be a time where we're going to be reaching out and asking you to get involved as business leaders and comment on these districts.
So that's an important aspect. So we'll come back to Jennifer, talk a little bit about the legislature and policy, because you mentioned that in Congress we're going to lose a seat. But because we have, quote, fewer people in California, the legislative districts are going to be collapsed a little bit when we redraw the lines. And they're going to be a little different. And so different legislators are going to be looking to say, where do I run? Who are my constituents going to be? Are they going to be any different? And so Jennifer, maybe a little bit of how this all plays out, where we see the priorities in the legislature. Do we have help with some unions dealing with things that want to improve the economy and make things better? And are other people, as Dan Walters said, more interested in adopting the Western European strategy of more government is better government?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we do see some of this playing out in the legislature with regards to the priorities that are moving forward and what is top of mind, I guess, for the legislature as we go through this process. So it's easy to see the influence of labor unions, environmentalists, and progressives with the number of bills that are moving through the process right now. As I mentioned several of them before, those are all backed by employment labor unions, environmentalists, progressives with regards to tax increases and new labor law mandates. That's where we can really see some of the push behind getting their agenda moving through the legislature. And we expect a lot of this has to do with the recall, and ultimately where decisions will be made on policy may have been influenced by those politics. But on the other side, interestingly, we see help from some of the labor unions when it comes to environmental issues, banning fracking in California when we have no alternatives for other gas, and the loss of jobs in the Central Valley. Additional mandates with regards to zero emission vehicles by 2035, as the governor has issued an executive order and is currently being considered in the legislature in a bill moving through the assembly. In those areas, we see the building trade unions who have those jobs very concerned with the direction that some of those policies are going in, and are actually opposed to those moving forward. And so it really depends on the policy area involved and the union involved as to whether we see them pushing mandates on employers or really trying to stop some of these mandates that are being pushed by environmentalists and progressives.
So Marty, let's take that and take it translated back into the politics a little bit. You know, we saw our new U.S. Senator Alex Padilla adopt the Green New Deal with AOC. And, you know, when he was in the legislature, he was a pretty balanced legislator, senator here in California. Are there reasons that he has to move, let's say, to adopt the Green New Deal, even though it may not be good for the economy for his election in 2022?
Well, yeah, I think that, you know, the pressure on Democratic elected officials is they're worried about a challenge from the left. And remember, in California, we have a top two primary system, a jungle primary, whatever you want to call it. And we saw this, and Dan referenced it earlier today, where Dianne Feinstein, when she was running for re-election a couple of years back, I mean, almost an iconic elected official here in California, right? She's been around since, 1992. She was challenged from the left by the state Senate pro tem, Kevin De Leon, and he made it through the top two process and was running against her when she was running against re-election. She dispatched him fairly handily, but I think that was kind of a warning sign for, you know, Democratic elected officials, that if they can be sufficiently progressive, I guess, for want of a better word, that they can fend off the impetus for a primary challenge from, you know, what we'll call the Sanders wing of the party, the Democratic Party.
So I think, you know, back to Jennifer's point when she mentioned the three bills, you know, the involvement, especially of the small business community, who has a great deal of sympathy over the pandemic, the consequences of the pandemic, to have the small business community throughout California engaged in saying there are pressure. I mean, as Marty pointed out, and I think as embracing the Green New Deal, Senator Padilla has seen what the challenges will be in his reelection. So we need to counter that. We need to make sure that people appreciate what's important to business, what types of energy are important to business, what type of tax structure is important to business, what kind of employment laws are important to business. So, you know, in the next year, you know, until the next 2022 election, we need the help of everybody who's out there in watching today to make sure that your legislator knows what's going on and what influences the economy and what influences small business and what you're able to deal with. I think, you know, now is the time, especially to make sure that everybody knows that you've been able to get through the pandemic. Some much more difficult than others, obviously, depending on what industry you're in. And we can't afford any new burdens, you know, that are going to make it more difficult. And I think I bring up, and I asked Marty to bring up the political discussion about where the pressures are, because there are pressures on the other side. And we need to make sure that there are pressures on the business side to say, we can't afford these. We can't afford these new laws. Things are hard enough as they are. And so, you know, these are the things that are really important, and to make sure that we have the ability to do the things. You know, the pressure. So I'll say there are certain things, you know, that you know, and you see this, I think, throughout the state. It's easy when you're a congressperson or a senator when you don't have to run the state. But throughout the country, you know, some governors are more right, some governors are more left. But at the same time, you have to run the state and manage the state and adopt policies that are going to be able to be, you know, that encourage the economy to grow. And I think Dan Walters really was pointed out an issue that's going to come forward. It's a good argument to be made, is that we are flush with revenues. There's no question about it. The state is, because the economy is doing well. And because there's certain, you know, I find some of these tax increases measures to be punitive. We're going to punish wealth, but the wealth is what creates the money to be able to have tax revenues that you can build affordable housing, you can deal with a homeless crisis, you can put money in the pockets of people who have really suffered during the pandemic. And I think that's what we see the governor trying to accomplish here, you know, with the budget, and we'll see more of it be rolled out. But this is where your voice needs to be heard really significantly, and getting the economy. So I'm going to make a pitch here for all of you that don't have health problems on allergies or whatever, but you know, the vaccines are clearly the key. We see this throughout the world, that the countries that have been able to open up are the ones that have a high vaccination rate. So I encourage all of you to make sure that you get vaccinated, that you're, you know, whether it be your workers or whether your family, get vaccinated, because we saw what happened in Europe. You know, the other part of the wealth of the world, other than maybe parts of Asia, the European Union was in a lockdown when we were opening up because they botched their vaccine program. And so this is the difference. The vaccines are the difference. And if we want to keep opening up, we want that June 15th date to be, you know, to be a firm date, and move forward after that and be able to you know, have our events. I mean, I think really where people are struggling right now are in the hospitality industry, where you don't have the ability to have, you know, events and international travel. That's what we need to improve upon, and the vaccines will take us forward with that. So let me ask a few questions of Jennifer, because there have been a lot of burdens imposed because of the pandemic on safety rules for work, and Cal OSHA has been in the mix, and we've been working on trying to deal with that. And then I don't think we can leave without talking about our unemployment insurance deficit, in that we're borrowing money from the federal government to pay unemployment insurance claims from the California portion of it. So Jen?
Yes, so Cal OSHA, as many of you know, passed emergency standards in November to deal with COVID in the workplace. And those new regulations and standards were pretty significant with regards to the burdens they imposed on employers, such as exclusion pay. You had to provide an unlimited amount of paid time off for employees who potentially were exposed to COVID in the workplace, putting up barriers and dividers, ensuring social distancing, mask requirements. With regards to the ag community, there were transportation requirements and housing requirements that were just extremely challenging for the employers to implement when those were passed in November. Well, of course, we've seen as things change and CDC guidance changes and the guidelines change, that we're expecting changes to those Cal OSHA regulations very soon, maybe at the end of this month. And I will put in the plug to check Cal Chamber website and alerts, our blog, the Capitol Insider blog, that just gave a highlight of some of those changes that we expect. For those who are vaccinated, to further emphasize what Alan just said, there'll be some relaxed requirements with regards to vaccinated employees in the workplace, and additional standards with regards to those housing and transportation measures that I suggested in the ag industry. We'll also see some relaxing as well. So tune in for that and pay attention to some of the publications we put out on that end. But one thing I do want to emphasize is that even though we may see on June 15th, and we're hopeful on June 15th, that the economy will basically be allowed to reopen, that businesses will be allowed to reopen and really start operating back to normal in some extent. Those regulations, those mandates for Cal OSHA with regards to COVID-19 in the workplace will still be in place. So we need to make sure employers are mindful of that and they don't assume that June 15th, that means all of the COVID-19 regulations just go away. Speaking to the EDD deficit that we're facing. So and starting in about May of last year, our EDD fund went insolvent, meaning that we had to start borrowing from the federal government to pay unemployment benefits to all those employees who suffered job loss as a result of the pandemic. We're approximately $20 billion in deficit right now to the federal government. We have a $20 billion loan from them. It's expected from the EDD, the Employment Development Department, that that could go as high as $40 billion by the end of this year as we continue to see unemployment numbers that haven't gone down yet and individuals receiving those benefits. What that means for the employer community is that unless the government steps in and does something to reduce that loan, either at the federal level or here at the state level with the budget surplus we have, employers will ultimately be responsible for paying that debt back through increased taxes. And every year that the debt isn't paid off, those taxes continue to increase. It's a per employee tax, and it's basically a reduction of the federal tax credit that employers receive right now. That tax requirement won't go into effect until January of 2022. However, we are pushing right now, given the budget surplus that we have, for the governor to really address this huge deficit we have in the unemployment fund. And we are also advocating at the federal level for some forgiveness, although we are more likely to see some help from the state level. So that's another thing that employers should be mindful of and should be expecting to see us putting out a lot of information on that as well.
Yeah, and just to make sure everybody, because everybody's heard about the fraud at EDD, our deficit is not due to that fraud. That fraud was mostly with the federal additional supplemental program for independent contractors and gig workers. So that's where the fraud occurred. This is just really all the people in California applying for unemployment insurance who overtaxed our system. And in order to be able to continue to pay those benefits, we had to borrow money from the federal government. And it was about $10 billion after the Great Recession, and it took 9 or 10 years to pay that back with tax increases on all employers. We want to try to avoid that. Some other states have had the CARES money or American Rescue Plan money be dedicated to that to pay down that debt. So that is what we're pushing for, and we'll see what happens with the extra money. And with the governor's budget as part of it, and then the legislature gets to engage in that. So I'm sorry, we're not set up today for you to ask questions to Marty and Jennifer. So write them down, put them in your pocket, come to our live event next year in Sacramento and pull them out and say, Marty, what about this? So we're not going to be able to do that this year, but I want to thank you. And there's more to the program yet. Right now, we have a public service announcement from our major sponsor, Automobile Club of Southern California.
Great game.
Yes.
Hey, are you good to drive?
Unlike you, I've had a few, so I got a ride share.
Good call. Hey, see you Thursday.
See you, buddy.
We know it's never okay to drink and drive. Now we need to remember that it's never okay to text and drive. Studies have shown you're distracted for up to 27 seconds after using your phone. Don't drive intoxicated. Don't drive intoxicated. A sobering message from AAA.
Good morning. I'm Jennifer Johnson, Director of Local Chamber Relations at the California Chamber of Commerce. I'm honored to be here with you today to present the President Circle Award and the Small Business Advocate of the Year Award. The President Circle Award recognizes our top local chamber partners for their excellence in business advocacy and helping their members comply with California's complex employment laws. I present to you the 14 recipients of this year's President Circle Award. Greater Bakersfield Chamber of Commerce, Carlsbad Chamber of Commerce, Greater Coachella Valley Chamber of Commerce, Greater Conejo Valley Chamber of Commerce, El Centro Chamber of Commerce and Visitors Bureau, Greater High Desert Chamber of Commerce, Lake Elsinore Valley Chamber of Commerce, Long Beach Area Chamber of Commerce, Oxnard Chamber of Commerce, Greater Riverside Chambers of Commerce, Santa Maria Valley Chamber of Commerce, Simi Valley Chamber of Commerce, Temecula Valley Chamber of Commerce, and the Tulare Chamber of Commerce. Congratulations to all of our recipients. We commend you for all of your hard work fighting on behalf of California business over the last year. Now, the Small Business Advocate of the Year Award. Each year since 1996, the California Chamber of Commerce has recognized small business leaders who have done an exceptional job working on local, state, and federal advocacy efforts on behalf of small business. This year's recipient was selected from nominees submitted by local chambers from throughout the state. Our 2021 Small Business Advocate of the Year is Kirk Rosberg, president and owner of the Torrance Bakery in Torrance, California. Kirk served as chairman of the board of directors for the Torrance Area Chamber of Commerce. Kirk mentors hundreds of small business owners who make up the downtown Torrance business community and rallies businesses all over the city to be active and vocal in respect to job creation and advocacy. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, Kirk led industry-specific roundtables, convening small business leaders and government leaders to get small business owners' questions answered and facilitated working together to get problems solved. These roundtables also guided businesses to understanding the complicated Paycheck Protection Program and Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. He advocated for a parklet program for restaurants with the city of Torrance and met in person with Congresswoman Maxine Waters to discuss property managers and tenants and the effects of the pandemic was having on each of them. He also voiced opposition to hero and hazard pay requirements on the local and state level, speaking with Assemblymember Maratsuchi's office, the County Board of Supervisors, and at the Torrance Area Chamber's government affairs and board meetings. Over the years, Kirk has consistently been active in Private Attorney General's Act lawsuits, ADA issues, and class inspections. Kirk Rosberg is a true catalyst, convener, and champion for small business. Thank you, Kirk, and congratulations on being named Small Business Advocate of the Year. Again, we want to thank the sponsors of today's event. Our major sponsors, Automobile Club of Southern California, Crow LLP, and Esquire Plaza. Our global sponsors, CSAA Insurance Group. Our silver sponsors, Frontier Communications and Suburban Water Systems. And our bronze sponsor, Christensen Media. Please remember to take the event survey immediately after we end today. Lastly, the 95th annual Sacramento Host Breakfast, sponsored by the Sacramento Host Committee and the California Chamber of Commerce, is tomorrow at 8 a.m. If you would like to watch, please go to sacramentohostcommittee.com/register and register to watch on Zoom. Thank you for watching today's Capitol Summit and have a wonderful day.